If you would like to hear this article of the week read aloud, this is the place for you. We are just going to kind of go through this article together so you can hear it. If you are an auditory learner, this might be helpful for you. So, first article of the week is called What is a Refugee? Facts, FAQs, frequently asked questions, and how to help. So I'm just going to start from the top. You can follow along on your document or on mine on the screen. It says, there are more refugees in the world than ever before. About 26 million people have fled their countries because of conflict, violence, persecution, or human rights violations. That's greater than the number of people who live in Shanghai, China, the world's third largest megacity. And if I were me, because I am a note taker, I would have highlighted that sentence. That is, and the first one. There's more refugees than ever before. Those are just striking statements to me. Many more people than that, 79.5 million, have been forcibly displaced from their homes according to the UN Refugee Agency's latest report. The previous spike in displacement occurred after World War II when 60 million people were left homeless. Today's displaced include 4.2 million people who are seeking asylum, which is a vocab word that I highlighted later, and 45.7 million people who are displaced within their own countries because of violence, instability, or natural disasters. So I'm going to just clarify really quickly. If you are a refugee, one of the pieces of information you need to know is that you are outside of your country. So you are no longer within your country's borders, compared to people who they just call displaced are people who are still in their country, but they have been removed from their home or they've had to flee their home because of the violence or whatever it is that's going around. So there's 4.2 million people who are seeking asylum. That's people who are already in a different country who are applying to get the rights of that country and to be able to live a life being recognized as a citizen there. And then 45.7 million people are currently displaced in their own country. So here's some fast facts about refugees. 79.5 million people have been forced to flee their homes more than ever before. More than 2/3 of refugees and displaced Venezuelans who are not all registered as refugees, so there's more than 2/3, fled from these 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. 1 in 97 people, about 1% of the world's population, is displaced. That might not sound like a lot, but that is a lot of people. That's a lot, 79.5 million people. Refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school, which makes sense. Developing countries host about 85% of the world's refugees. Interesting, because a developing country we would think doesn't probably have the resources that our more developed countries would have, but they're the ones who are hosting refugees. So what's the definition of a refugee? It says refugees are people who have been forced to flee their home country because of war, persecution, or violence. They must establish a well-founded fear of persecution due to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social or ethnic group. The 1951 Refugee Convention outlines refugees' rights, including the right to non-refoulement, not to be returned to a country where he or she may be persecuted. So under international law, refugees have the right to not be sent back to the country that they just fled from, which at least there's that. This is one of the vocab words, by the way, and it defines it right here, so that should be an easy one. Next section. Refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people. So now we're going to get into what are the differences between these 4 types of people. So refugees flee their country because of credible threats of persecution and because they are not protected by their own country. So they are not going willingly. It's not like, hey, let's move. It is a dire situation. In contrast, migrants may leave their country for any reason, such as employment, family reunification, or education. A migrant is under the protection of his or her own government even when abroad and may return to their country of origin. So you might hear about migrant workers who will come to the U.S. for a season to do their job and earn money, and then they'll return back. That's a migrant worker. So that is a voluntary type situation, at least compared to being a refugee. Okay, now asylum seekers are people who have applied for protection, refugee status, on arrival in a country besides their own. So if somebody is fleeing from Syria and then they go to Turkey and they try to apply for protection there and to become a citizen, they're considered an asylum seeker. Now, they were a refugee, but now we've taken the next step. And last but not least, internally displaced people, IDPs, are displaced by conflict, violence, or natural disasters. Here's the key: within their own country. So it's that word again of being displaced. So these people have been removed from their home forcibly, but they're still in that country where they came from. So what are the biggest refugee crises in the world? The Syrian civil war has led to the largest refugee crisis in modern times. The economic collapse of Venezuela has also led to massive displacement. Conflicts in South Sudan, Myanmar, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have caused millions of people to flee in the past few years. Refugee displacements from Afghanistan and Somalia date back decades, and the humanitarian needs continue. Other countries where masses of people have been displaced either internally or have fled from violence. Iraq, about 2.4 million Iraqis are displaced. Iraq also hosts 250,000 Syrian refugees. So that's amazing to me, is that this is a dangerous place, obviously, because there's so many people who are displaced within that country, and yet 250,000 Syrian refugees have tried to find safe haven there because it must be at least a better situation than where they came from. Central African Republic, about 593,000 people have fled from violence in the Central African Republic, and about 600,000 people are displaced within the country. And finally, Central America. The number of people fleeing violence has increased tenfold in the past 5 years. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have seen a spike in violence from criminal groups within that time frame. So they're suggesting that that might be a reason that people are fleeing there. What rights and obligations do refugees have under international law? Refugees have the right to safe asylum and not to be returned to possible persecution, in their country of origin. So that was that non-refoulement we talked about earlier. According to the 1951 Refugee Convention, they are entitled to the basic rights belonging to any other foreigner in the host country, especially the right to practice their religion, pursue education, and to move about freely. They are required to follow and respect the laws of the country that accepts them. Sometimes an influx of refugees is sudden and immense. Refugee camps, which you will see a picture of in our slides, are set up to provide temporary shelter and safety for them. These are places where aid groups can deliver food, water, and other services. As time goes on, they sometimes become thriving communities, and I like the word thriving. I don't know how I would define that based on pictures I've seen. Worldwide, the UN estimates that about 36% of refugees live in camps. That's a lot. How are children affected by the refugee crises? This is the last paragraph. From 30 to 34 million of the world's displaced people are children, about 40%. Many have undergone devastating experiences and lost everything familiar to them, including family members and friends. Child refugees from protracted crises, so very long-term crisis situations such as the Syrian civil war, may spend all of their childhood years in exile from their home country. The UN Refugee Agency counted more than 153,000 refugee children who were unaccompanied or separated from parents or adult caregivers in 2019. 153,000 children unaccompanied in these really dangerous situations. I can't even imagine. I feel like I shouldn't be unaccompanied right now. The numbers of displaced children living on their own is estimated to be much higher because not all governments keep track of them. So that is probably a vast underestimate. So there is that article for you. Hopefully you learned a lot about refugees. I know I did.